one of our earliest videos, we considered signed documents, physically signed documents, and how a forensic document examiner could, in principle, decide whether that was a true signature or whether the signature was forged. In the digital world, we have an equivalent notion of digital signatures. And we have to ask the question, if a document has been signed digitally, can that digital signature be forged, or is it proof that the document was indeed signed by the person who purportedly signed it? Clearly, there are various aspects we need to consider. Let's just mention one or two brief preliminary remarks. Typically, to sign a document digitally, you need some access to the key, and once that key is leaked, then anyone can use it. So we have to assume that the key is not leaked. We have to assume that it has all been kept secure. And those are not easy issues to dismiss. But for our purposes, I'm not going to go into those aspects. They tend to be more physical world aspects than digital world aspects in many cases. If a computer has, for example, been stolen and it contains the key, that would be an example of where a key is leaked. However, it is obvious that the key can also leak after a hacking attempt. But nonetheless, let's continue with the more significant question. Let's suppose things have worked as they were supposed to work, and we now ask the question, can we prove that the document has been signed by the owner of the key, or do we have problems? Non-repudiation is one of the well-known problems in computer security, and digital signatures is the solution that is generally accepted for non-repudiation. There is a fairly widespread acceptance that once a document has been signed, that constitutes proof that the owner signed it. In fact, we even have it encoded in some laws. In the South African ECT Act, the Electronic Commerce and Transactions Act, it is stated that if something has been signed by an advanced electronic signature, that is indisputable to a large degree. I'm not going to try and discuss the law now. That part of the law has not yet come into effect, because no issuer of signed public keys has been appointed as would be required by the law. One of the security challenges that has existed for a long time is the notion of non-repudiation. And it is widely accepted that once something has been signed digitally, it cannot be repudiated. So there's very little incentive to look at a signed document, a digitally signed document, from a forensic perspective. And not much, if anything, has been done in the literature about digitally signed documents. However, there are a couple of issues that we need to consider beyond the initial problems that I mentioned. One of the problems that we have to think about is that signed documents are very often questioned long after they've been signed. And one of the problems we know with cryptographic techniques is that they tend to become weaker over time. Weaker in the sense that a certain computational power is required to break them, and that power is not available at the time that the document is encrypted. However, a decade or two later, then that computational power may be easily obtainable and that cipher is no longer safe. I went from a digital signature to encryption. The two are obviously related, and we will talk about the relationship in a moment or two. The question then is, if something has been signed a decade, 2 decades ago, can we still trust that signature, even though it may have been perfect at the point that the document was signed? There are a number of solutions that are generally used in the world of encryption to cater for this problem that computational power makes it easier to break a cipher. And those challenges are usually met by solutions such as replacing algorithms that have grown too old, or for a number of algorithms, increasing the key length so that it becomes harder to find this longer key. There's also the notion of key replacement, where you start to use a new key every once in a while, so that if someone finds the old key, then they cannot use the old key to break things that have been encrypted with a new key. Now, that is particularly useful in the case of data communications, where something on the network cannot be broken. It is less useful for documents that exist on, let's say, a disk, because either you have to go and re-encrypt things with a new key and then have the higher protection, or you have to live with the key that was used when the document was encrypted. And clearly, when we are talking about something that has been signed, then it cannot be re-signed later with a new key just on behalf of the person who signed it, because that person may not be available. In fact, it may be years after that person has died that a questioned document has to be examined. So a lot of those solutions simply do not work in the case of digital signatures. Built into many algorithms is the notion of key expiration. A key will expire after a certain time. That is done for two reasons. The one reason is the fact that a key may not be strong enough anymore. So the key that is used for this encryption or to sign a document, I'll use the two interchangeably for a little while, that key may not be powerful enough to last for long enough, and therefore we need to let it expire. There's also the other problem that once a key becomes compromised, it has to be revoked. And once it's been revoked, it is no longer trusted. But people also forget the passwords that they have associated with keys, and they cannot necessarily tell the world that they've revoked this key. And if the key expires, then it automatically solves the problem, at least at the point when we reach that time point at which it should have expired. One of the interesting mechanisms that was used, particularly in earlier years, to test the duration or durability of keys was various competitions that were held for encryption algorithms. I think the most famous of these competitions was the competitions that were held for the RSA algorithm, Rivest, Shamir and Adelman's algorithm, and we'll have to say more about that algorithm in a moment or two. However, the competition consisted of publishing documents that were encrypted with a certain key, and then they had to be decrypted for a certain prize money, or in the RSA case specifically, a large number was published and that number had to be factored. And there was a lot of money at stake. You could win a prize of a few $100,000 if you could break it. Those competitions are no longer active, but if you go and look at the original competition, you will see that many of those have not been broken yet. A couple of decades, well, at least a decade and a half after they've been published. And there is still some esteem in trying to win this competition, even though it is no longer active. the Rsa competition consisted of publishing, let's call them keys for the time being, that were increasing in length. And the short ones were rather easy to break, and people could win, and did win, a fair amount of money. But the longer keys were much harder to break. And those are ones that are still open, that to the best of my knowledge at least, have not been broken yet. As I said, the competition is no longer running, but I think a lot of cryptographers probably keep their eyes on those challenges still to see whether anything can be done. And that gives you an indication of how long a key may last. I want this video to be somewhat less technical than some of the other videos in the series, and I am therefore going to consider some of the background material that you are probably familiar with if you are a typical security student or security practitioner. And I want to do this with the hope that this will be somewhat more accessible to regular questioned document examiners, physical questioned document examiners. So bear with me while I go through some of this fairly familiar background stuff that everyone in the field of security probably knows about. First background point we need to raise, and we're not going to use this much, is the notion of symmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption, or secret key encryption, is a technique where all parties get the same key. And that's a challenge. How do you get those keys to all parties? It's a key distribution problem. But suppose we have our typical Bob and Alice and they want to communicate, then you have to get the key to both Bob and Alice. And once you have the key at both Bob and Alice, then Bob can simply use the key and encrypt the message, send it to Alice, and Alice can use the same key to decrypt it. There we are talking about algorithms like DES, which had a lifetime of 20 years, introduced in 1977, so it should have expired, its use should have stopped before the turn of the century. However, it was used well beyond its lifetime in a couple of cases, many cases, by combining the algorithm. So you would run DES on a particular piece of text forwards, and then use the same key and run it backwards, and then run it forwards again, and that would give you the so-called triple DES solution that was deemed to be stronger than DES, while they were waiting for its replacement algorithm, the Advanced Encryption Standard, AES. AES was selected after a long process, and AES can be used with different key lengths. And therefore, in principle at least, if AES becomes too easy to break, then we can simply use a longer key length. However, it does pose the problem that we mentioned earlier, that this is not of much use if you want to talk about a document that has been signed a long time ago. Good news, these symmetric algorithms, these secret key algorithms, have very little to do with signing of documents, and I purely mentioned it as the starting point of typical encryption schemes. The next background item on our agenda is the use of public key cryptography. Public key cryptography works as follows. Again, Alice and Bob want to communicate. In our example, Alice creates a pair of keys. The one key, or the one part of that key, is secret, and Alice hides that key, stows it away. The other key is public, so Alice publishes it, and when Bob wants to send an encrypted message to Alice, Bob simply obtains Alice's public key, uses that to encrypt the message, and sends the message across to Alice. Alice has the secret key. She uses that secret key to decrypt the message. She is the only person with that secret key, so she's the only one who is able to decrypt the message. No one else in the world who intercepts the message is able to decrypt it. Obviously, unless the cryptography algorithm is broken, which at this stage we are assuming is not a problem, but we will return to the problem that it may be broken a little bit later. Note that these public key cryptography algorithms are rather expensive computationally. So if you want to, for example, communicate between two parties, then you will very often use public key cryptography to establish a connection between the two parties. One party will generate a key, some random number, for example, and transmit that number to the other party as a key to be used for subsequent communication. And then once they both have a copy of this key that was transmitted securely using public key cryptography, they can now switch off their public key cryptography and they can return to secret key cryptography. They both have this key that is now known as a session key, and for this session, they will communicate using this key and the much cheaper symmetric encryption algorithms. Works well for communication. It's still not the problem that we are particularly interested in. Our problem is, how do you sign a document? And signing of a document works as follows. What you do is, if you want to sign a document, is you create a cryptographic hash of the document. We'll return to this notion a little bit later. But this cryptographic hash is a number that you've computed, a very, very long number, and it is designed such that if you make a small change to the document, then it will cause a huge change in this number, in this hash that you've calculated. Also, it's impossible to reverse engineer it. You cannot start with a hash and then create a document that matches that hash. So you can't follow this algorithm backwards. Number 3, you have very few collisions. It's unlikely that you will ever create a document and then another document. The two will hash to the same value. In particularly, if we are talking about a message of sorts, then something that makes sense. I said unlikely. It is extremely unlikely, close to impossible. Now that you've calculated this hash, you can use it to sign the document in the following manner. You use your key pair, your public secret key pair that you would have used for normal public key encryption. Normally, people would have used your public key and they would then encrypt the document they want to send to you with a public key, and you will decrypt it with a secret key. Now you reverse the process. You take this hash that you've calculated and you encrypt it with your secret key. In our example, Alice encrypts this message with her secret key. She sends the message across to Bob. When Bob receives this message, Bob takes Alice's public key. Remember, he's communicated with Alice in the past, so it's not a problem. And what Bob does is he decrypts the message that he received from Alice using the public key. She encrypted it with her private key, with a secret key. Bob decrypts it with a public key. Bob also determines the calculation of the same hash over the message that has purportedly been signed. And then Bob can compare these two hashes, the one that was encrypted by Alice and the one that Bob calculated, and if the two match, Bob knows that Alice indeed signed this document, and therefore Bob can rely on its contents. Note that in our example, this message was sent as clear text. And often it's good enough to send the message as clear text. Often the question is not whether the document should be secret or not. The question is whether Alice did in fact send this message. That's the entire idea of signing the document. If we also wanted security on top of this, then Alice could have encrypted this signature that she calculated, and the entire document for that matter, and encrypted all of that using Bob's public key, and Bob would then have been able to decrypt it with his secret key, and then he would have had the clear text message, and he would have had the signature, and he would have proceeded as we explained just now. So if you want secret communications on top of a signature, you just add encryption on top of that. In our case, we are assuming that we sit with a document, it's open, it's not encrypted, but it has been signed, and we want to determine whether it was in fact Alice who signed the document, and the scenario that we just described using Bob and Alice solved that problem. One challenge with the example that we've just described is the fact that Bob was already familiar, for whatever reason, with Alice's public key. Now, a couple of things could have happened in the meantime. Alice could have revoked her key because it was compromised. But I think the more general problem we have to ask before we even get to that problem is the question, if Bob did not know what Alice's public key was, how would Bob be able to determine the authenticity of the public key? The public key is indeed out there, somewhere published on the web, for example, but Bob does not know whether that is authentic. In fact, an attacker can publish a key on behalf of Alice, make it widely available, and then start using the secret key that is associated with this fake Alice key and start to sign documents on behalf of Alice. And someone who goes out and finds this public key will see that the owner of this key pair is indeed able to sign documents. However, this person does not know that it is not Alice, that it is an imposter. There are at least two approaches to solve this problem. In both approaches, you get someone to sign your public key. And when they sign your public key, they basically consider that public key as a document, and they append their signature to attest to the fact that this key belongs to you. Clearly, there is a little bit of a challenge. We are in the digital world. How do we identify you? We have to use something that is unique to you. So if you are a company or something, then maybe a company registration number or the company name may be sufficient. If you're an individual, your name may be sufficient, but perhaps an ID number, or in other parts of the world, a social security number may be useful. But it's a challenge to find a digital representation of you. So we will have to look into that a little bit deeper. There's also the question, when they attest to this, what do they actually attest to? Do they just attest to the fact that this public key belongs to you, or is there anything more associated with this? Once they've signed your key, we've sort of just propagated the problem, because once it's signed, we need to find whether that signature that signed your public key is valid. So we have to find the signer's public key and know that the signer indeed is authentic. And then there's also the question, do we trust this signer? Because the signer of your public key may be someone who's just willing to sign anything. So there's an issue of trust in there. And this is where the two mechanisms, the two approaches diverge. In the one approach, you build what is known as a web of trust. So whoever signs your public key needs to have his or her key, public key, signed by someone else. And that someone else has to have his or her public key signed by someone else again, and so on. And once you have enough people who've signed one another's keys, it forms this web, and there is a pretty large likelihood that if you're part of a community in particular, where that encryption technique is widely used, you will know someone from whom you've obtained a public key personally, so you trust that person, and you'll be able to traverse this web of trust, and you will find that the keys have been signed all the way up to Alice's key that you now want to use, Alice's key that you now want to trust. The other approach is a somewhat more formal approach where you get certain authorities, so-called certificate authorities, and their job, their function, their purpose in life is to sign people's keys. So you go to a certificate authority, and then this certificate authority signs your key, and you get a certificate issued that states this key does belong to you. But with certificate authorities, we have the same problem. Yes, they signed your key, but who signed their key? And the technical term that is used here is the notion of Pki, or Public Key Infrastructure, and ideally we would have a world where there is one super signer at the top, perhaps the United Nations, and then their key will be widely known, it will be published all over the place, everybody will know about it, and they will then sign a country's certificate authority. And that, as an aside, is one of the things that we don't have in South Africa yet. We don't have a national certificate authority. And quite interesting to go and read up a little bit about the contenders. Who are the players who would like to be that national certificate authority? And then they can sign other certificate authorities whom they trust, and eventually it will get down to a more consumer level where you get something that is signed on your behalf. How this works in practice is slightly different, since we do not have this ideal structure in place, this ideal Pki infrastructure. The problem has largely been relegated to providers of security tools. A number of players in the world saw this problem arising early enough, and they started acting as certificate authorities. And this was not used for signatures initially primarily, but it was used just to get encryption going. And the real challenge was when you were communicating with a party who purported to be some business, for example, a bank, for example, that it's actually the bank you are communicating with. And with online banking, you wanted to access the bank via your browser. So a couple of people who had the necessary insight started acting as certificate authorities. It's a pretty simple process to take someone's signature and sign it. Almost anyone with a little bit of technical know-how can do that. However, what some players did correctly is they went to the providers of browsers, internet browsers, and they agreed with them to include their public keys into the browser as a trusted key. As an example that is very well known to South Africans, Mark Shuttleworth was one such party who got his public key included into the early browsers. And therefore, if he issued certificates through his company, which was named Thought, then the keys would be trusted by the browser and actions could proceed. I think most South Africans are also aware that Mark Shuttleworth eventually sold his company, Thought, to VeriSign, and he used some of the proceeds to create the company Canonical that is responsible for building the Ubuntu Linux distribution. I guess more South Africans know about the fact that he used some of the proceeds to become the second space tourist in the world, flew up with a Russian spaceship to the International Space Station and spent a while there before he returned. But that is not part of the topic we're discussing today. We are discussing signatures, and we are busy talking about certificate authorities. In fact, it is quite interesting to look at the certificate authorities that are implicitly trusted by you. If you just go to your computer settings and you look at whoever is trusted as a certificate authority, you'd be amazed by the level of trust that you extend to people or to parties whom you've probably never met. And Microsoft or Google or some creator of a web server or an operating system determined that this is a trustworthy party and you can accept keys that have been signed by them. Whether you can really trust them is a matter for debate. Most of them depend on trust for their business model, so there is an economic argument to be made that you can indeed trust them. But when we get to a questioned document and we want to convince the court, and there is an implicit trust of such a company, it raises a couple of additional questions that we have to ask about. But let's return to the basics. What we've been talking about is a key that has been signed by some trustworthy party. So suppose Alice wants to get her key signed. She takes the key and whatever proof of identity she requires, perhaps a book by Lewis Carroll, and she takes that to someone she trusts. Let's say it's Kay. So takes it over to Kay. Kay looks at her credentials, or perhaps Kay knows her, and Kay signs her public key. She can now go home and publish her public key where anyone in the world can see that Kay has signed it. When Bob receives a signed message from Alice, Bob can look at the key, at the public key, and he can see that this key has been signed by Kay. So the question now is, does he trust Kay? Does he even know Kay? And then, as we said earlier, there are these two options. Either Kay fits into a whole hierarchy of certificate authorities, and we move from some worldwide known party, or from all these parties that are implicitly trusted by your operating system on your behalf, or we move through this web of trust to see whether Bob and Kay have any friends in common, and we can find a chain of signatures from Kay to someone whom Bob knows personally, and that gives Bob reason to trust Kay's signature of Alice's public key. Pretty Good Privacy, or PGP, is a suite of programs that was written by Phil Zimmerman in the early 1990s. He developed it for humanitarian purposes, to enable activists to talk to one another without the ability of government snooping in on what they were discussing. The program was, or set of programs, was the first public key implementation that was widely distributed, and it became very popular, very widely used across the world. Those who are interested can go and read the story again of the troubles it caused for Phil Zimmermann, because cryptography was considered to be munitions, and arms export controls regulated the export of cryptography from the United States. So there was a long, protracted battle between Phil Zimmermann and the authorities, and they tried all sorts of interesting ideas on how to export cryptography without violating the relevant legislation. However, that is not important for our purpose right now. In the 1990s and beyond, PGP became very popular. It was one of the only programs that was really freely available that you could use to encrypt your email messages, but also to sign them. And I think most people who were studying computer science at that time had a PGP key, and they were actively using it. In some cases, because they wanted to sign messages, in other cases because they wanted to encrypt it, and every once in a while just to exchange an examination paper with a colleague. PGP was fantastic. It worked really well. Since PGP was free, it did not make Phil Zimmermann a rich man, and eventually it was taken over by another company and moved the path of commercial software. In the meantime, the ideas that underlie PGP have been written down in an RFC, and open source software has been developed with the name GPG, the GNU Privacy Guard. So the technology is still available, it's still easy to use it, and many open source implementations are available. Of course, given its original purpose, there was no assumption there that you would get some formal institutionalized public key infrastructure. It was communication again amongst colleagues, people working for the same cause. And hence the notion of a web of trust made sense. Back in those days, they even had key signing parties, almost like a Tupperware party, where people would go and they would sign one another's keys. And you could upload your keys to public key servers, and many of those key servers are still running to this day. And you can download keys from those key servers. So if I want someone's public key, I just go to a public key server, let's say the one at MIT, and I obtain the key, and I am able to send email. Whether the recipient still has the necessary software to decrypt it, I don't know. As I said, back in the day, we all had the software available on our machines, so it was no big deal. Now, if I receive PGP encrypted email, I'll probably have to just make sure that I've got the latest GPG software to be able to use it. But there's a second part of this video will be a case study on some of the experiences I had trying to recently look back at my PGP signed messages and to see whether I could still authenticate them. So this is the typical forensic case where one goes back and says, I have this document from a long time ago. Can it work? Can it still work? And to give away just one of the issues, earlier in this video, I mentioned the fact that you needed some mechanism to identify people, some number. And the mechanism that was used to identify people in PGP was their email address. And you can immediately begin to see the problems. How many people still have the same email addresses? that they used 10 or 20 years ago. But that's not the only problem. So wait for that discussion, and then we will see what the implications are. Another issue, of course, is, do I, at this stage, trust the key? Because it may have been signed by many people, but do I still know anything about them? Are they still part of my circle of friends? And it's a really good question. In fact, what I did find was that very few of the keys that we used amongst ourselves were signed by many other people. So in a lot of cases, because you knew the person to whom you sent an email, it was pretty easy to exchange the so-called fingerprint of your key. So while you chatted to someone, you just gave the person the fingerprint, which was in essence a little hash of the public key. And when they received the email, they could compare it against that hash and they could check it. Many people had their fingerprints, their key fingerprints, printed on their business cards as well. So looking at the business card, you could see what the fingerprint would be, and it was pretty simple to authenticate the key, the public key, and from there you could then use it to authenticate the message. It's been a long, long time since I've seen any business card with a PGP fingerprint printed on it. So expect quite a couple of issues when we get to that point in the video. Let's explore how one can, in principle, use GPG, or the GNU Privacy Guard. I'm going to use Cleopatra. It's a GUI interface for the functionality offered by GPG. Also acts as a certificate manager. You may see that there is a pretty old address of me listed in my keyring there. I haven't included recent keys in it, and this particular key was valid from 1998, 19th of October, in fact, and there is the key ID, the fingerprint. You can see there is no expiry date, and that address no longer exists. That institution, in fact, no longer exists. To explore the functionality, you can see there that I can sign or encrypt a file. I can decrypt or verify a file. In both of these cases, I will select the file, and the file will then be encrypted or decrypted or signed or whatever my choices are. I can also import a certificate from a file or export a certificate to a file, or I can take someone's key and certify it, sign it. I can find information on a server, and we will look at that in a moment or two. Just let's start with the notepad functionality, because that is arguably the easiest introduction to how this tool works. We can tell it who the recipient should be, because if I want to encrypt something, I should encrypt it with that person's public key. What I want to do is I want to enter a message, and this is simply a message that I got from my inbox from a long time ago, and it is a message that I sent from one of my addresses to another address, and you can see there is a signed message. So from that demarcation right to the bottom of that demarcation, that is the message, and then there is the signature. What the message says, if you don't understand that, don't worry about it. Perhaps I should point out that this was sent on the 19th of October 1998. Now, if I were to say decrypt or verify this, then it will see that what we have is a signature, and therefore it will verify the signature, And what we are getting is something that says this is a valid signature. It was signed by me using that very, very old address, and this signature was created on the 19th of October 1998. So this is one way. If I were to receive an email from someone, I can just quickly paste it into the notepad and I can click on verify, and it will tell me whether that is indeed a valid signature. Also tell me a valid signature by whom. As an alternative, if I want to take a message and I just want to say, let's say, hello world, and I'm going to say encrypt this, then it's going to ask me for a password. It is off screen at the moment, but there you can see that it will use my current email address. Obviously, I'm not going to type in the password while you are watching. Password entered, I click on OK, and there is my message encrypted. Now suppose I just want to sign this message. There's hello world, and recipients, I'm going to use my certificate to sign it, but I'm not going to encrypt it for anyone. Go back to the notice board and tell it to just sign it. And there is the message signed. You can see that the SHA-256 hash has been used, modern, well-known cryptographic hash, and there is the signature. If I want to check this, so I can just close that little box. If I want to check this, I can say decrypt or verify, and it tells me that this is a valid signature. It was signed by me, and there are the details of the certificate. Now suppose I want to send a message to someone else. Let's look at how I can do this. I can enter details about the person to whom I want to send this message. One of the better options would be to enter the fingerprint of the certificate, or I can also enter the email address. That would be very good. However, I can also enter a name for it. If I enter a name here, it may provide me with a list of people's addresses. I don't want to display those addresses. Clearly, the scheme comes from a time before we had big spammers around. So I'm just going to take this here off to one side, let's say there, and I am going to look for Steve Jobs. It takes a while, but you can see a bunch of Steve Jobs entries. Interesting ones. There is something that is Apple at something, and so on. Scrolling through it, there is one that seems rather interesting. So, oops, I've just imported it. When I want to import it, it asks me the question, do I have reason to believe that this is actually the email address of this person? So perhaps I should phone the person and double check, is this the person? Or I should use a business card where the fingerprint is listed. Or I should find it on a trusted website. It asks me, do I really want to proceed? No, I'm not going to proceed. I'm not going to mark this as trusted. In fact, I'm just going to say no. In fact, if you try to find me, then you find quite a couple of addresses, and it's a fairly popular name. So that one and that one used to be me. I've not uploaded my recent certificates to the key server, again because it is potentially a source for spammers to find email addresses. I can open up that certificate there, and I can ask for its details, and there are the details. Old address, the one created in 1998, and there again you see the fingerprint and so on. I can ask for more details. I can use it to certify, to sign, to encrypt, and so on. And I incorporated multiple algorithms that could be used in that. I can also look at the certifications. So if I click on certifications, then the question is who signed my signature, and you can see that the only person who signed it is I personally, using a much newer certificate. Without me signing this, it would not have been deemed as trusted, and verification would have failed. I am going to use this now for a second example. This is a partial email. You can see that this was sent on the 4th of August 1999. It was sent by the ACM, and it was sent to me at my old address, and the ACM informed me that they changed my address on their database. If I say decrypt or verify it, it tells me that it couldn't verify it because there is a certificate that is not available, and that is the certificate that is not available. So why is that not available? Let's just try and find it on the server. And here you can see that I can enter the fingerprint, and I can say search, and there I get it. It's the ACM notification system, and I can ask if I click on it, I can say it should import it to my system. What we get is a message that it found one certificate, it imported 0 of them, and it skipped the deprecated PGP2 keys. So it considers those keys to be too old to be useful, and therefore it did not import it. Now I sit here with this message 21, 22, 23 years later, and I can't verify it because the key that was used to sign it is no longer deemed to be a reliable key. And this is one of the problems we run into when we want to verify an old document such as this. It's exactly the forensic case where we are stuck. You can see that the signature was created in 1999, but it's useless. As you are well aware, I quite like trying things through the command line as well, and I have GPG installed on this machine, and let's just see what it can do for me. Going to pipe it via less. You will not be able to see everything on the screen because I'm just showing you a partial screen, but there are the options. So it is a very rich set of options, and I can do all sorts of interesting things with it. However, I'm not going to try and illustrate those in the current video. I'm going to leave it up to you to explore that in more detail. GPG in this form is available on more or less any operating system. Here I'm running it on Windows, but it is also a standard part of all Linux distributions. Whether you have to add it as an add-on or whether it comes pre-installed depends on the distribution, but it will be available. Pki Infrastructure is a much more formal approach. The X509 certificate standard is arguably the best known certificate standard outside perhaps the PGP category of certificates, if you want to use the name certificates there. X509 was originally derived from an X500 standard, which was published by the CCITT back in the day, nowadays known as ITU-T. That's the Technical Committee of the International Telecommunications Unit. X500 was a directory structure. It was a very comprehensive directory structure and never really used in practice. However, it has led to the spin-off of a lightweight directory access protocol, LDAP, and many of us are somewhat familiar with LDAP, or the general notion of active directories. So a directory is typically like a telephone book in which you put users and the various things you want to know about them. For example, what their office number is, what their telephone number is, what their email address is, and so on. So in that sense, it is a directory. And X500 makes provision for directories on various levels. So we can have information about individuals, but we can also have information about organizations or organizational units. And in that sense, it is very hierarchical. You start at the country level and you move down to the organization and then to the department and then to the individual. And that doesn't necessarily reflect the way we want to characterize individuals in general. X509 was originally published as part of the X500 project. It was revised, the original version was known as version 1, then version 2 was issued in the X500 project, and version 3 was issued outside the X500 project. Some of the earlier standards, some of the earlier attempts to provide private email, specifically privacy enhanced mail or PEM, used version 1 and version 2 certificates from the original X500 specification, and a lot of experience was gained from that. And therefore, when version 3 of X509 was published, it included information that they found lacking, that they wanted to include in privacy-enhanced mail, but couldn't. So version 3 is the one that is used on the web, all over the web, but it comes from a directory of both organizations and people, and it also comes from experience with email, where you have individual correspondence. If we look at the X509 specification as it found its way into RFC 5280, then we can see that a lot of aspects are covered. In the RFC, they talk about the various fields in the certificate. They talk about extensions. Specifically, when we look at the fields, then you can see that they talk about a version number, a serial number, a signature, who the issuer is, the validity from when it is valid until when it is valid, and so on, and also a bunch of extensions that have been added. In addition, you can see information about the certificate revocation list, where a certificate is no longer valid, even though it is still within its validity period, and it has been withdrawn for some reason, perhaps because a key was compromised or some other mishap, or perhaps the person is no longer situated in that organization and the directory needed modification, and hence the certificate also needed to be revoked. So, one of the diagrams in RFC 5280 provides us with a picture of the parties involved in this. At the top of this diagram, you can see the end entity. So that's the end user, whether it is the organization who uses it or whether it is the individual to whom the certificate has been issued. And then going down the list, you will see a certificate authority, a CA, and that certificate authority may interact with the end entity. The certificate authority may also interact with a registration authority who doesn't act as a certificate authority, but takes on some of the administrative responsibilities of a certificate authority. And you can also see that the certificate authority interacts with the certificate revocation list issuer. And all of those parties publish various aspects to a repository that contains all the certificates and the list of revoked certificates. Can also see that the certificate authority interacts with other certificate authorities and provides us with the beginnings of this. It's a rather lengthy RFC, and especially the early parts of it are quite easy to read and gives one context where all of this comes from. And I highly recommend that you look at that for some background. Towards the end of the standard, a couple of examples of certificates are provided. An example that perhaps feels more natural is one that is provided on Wikipedia, and it is a certificate for Wikipedia itself. You see the various fields highlighted, in particular moving from the bigger context, the country, to the organizational unit, and perhaps to an individual. So looking at this example, you can see that this is a version 3 certificate. You can see some information about the certificate authority. You can see the canonical name for this particular certificate is *.wikipedia.org. And then you see information about the public key of wikipedia.org. You can also see that it makes provision for a number of alternative names. So even though this certificate is issued to wikipedia.org, it also makes provision for m.wikibooks.org, m.wikimediafoundation.org, and so on. A whole long list of parties that are also covered by this same certificate. One of the places where you can explore certificates a little bit is right in your browser. If you look at the URL of any site that you are visiting, then you will see that famous little lock. It's become tinier and tinier over time, but right to the left of the URL that you are visiting, you will typically see this tiny lock. Clicking on it will take you to the certificate information. You can click on the certificate and it will tell you that it is valid, hopefully. And then you can also open it up and look at the details of it. You can look at the chain that is used to certify it, And you can also export these certificates. Unfortunately, if you export them on the browsers on which I tried this, they are exported into some binary format that is readable by other software. So it's not exported for human consumption. And to see it clearly, to see exactly what it contains, you'll require something to unpack it from its binary format. To explore this a bit further, it is quite interesting to look at the certificates that are trusted by your computer. And the easiest way, again, is to go via the browser. In some cases, you will see that the browser points you to the operating system. In other words, the browser and the operating system trust the same certificates. In other cases, the browser will maintain its own list of certificates that it trusts. As an example of the latter, Mozilla Firefox is arguably the best. So let's quickly look at the certificates that happen to be trusted by my particular browser that I have installed. I have not added to anything, so they are quite likely to be the same ones that are trusted by your version of Mozilla Firefox. In order to access the list of certificates, I have to click on the menu icon in the top right-hand corner of Firefox. Then I have to select Options, then Privacy and Security, and then I can scroll right down to the bottom, and there is the setting for certificates. Click on View Certificates, and it opens a certificate manager. There are entries for people and other trusted parties, also my own certificates. But unless you are an active user of such certificates, they are all likely to be empty, and the only entry, the only tab that contains information is the one about certificate authorities. And then just scroll through them, knowing that while you are scrolling through them, you are looking at a list of organizations whom you trust. And then ask yourself, do you know anything about those organizations? Are they trustworthy? In the vast majority of cases, I don't even recognize their names. Yet, I implicitly trust them for at least certain functionalities. As you can see, it's a fairly long list. One of the certificate authorities that we scrolled past is indeed a national certificate authority. If you look at the Staat der Nederlanden, then you will see a Dutch certificate authority that is an official Dutch organization that issues certificates on a national level. I don't know about any other national examples in this list, but it's definitely worth looking at them again and looking at some of those that seem to be country names, figure out whether they are also national certificate authorities or whether they just happen to use the name that sounds like a country. On Chrome, you may follow essentially the same procedure, going to the settings or the options, scrolling to the security part, and then looking at the certificates. In this case, you will see that it takes you to an external window, and there you can see the operating system certificates, and that includes software that I've installed. It includes a couple of other interesting things, but for our purposes, the important aspect is the list of root certificate authorities. Quite a lengthy list as we scroll through them. We interrupt this video for an important announcement. After some emergency dental work, pronunciation and factual content provided beyond this point may not be entirely accurate due to the drugs necessary for the dental work that was performed. During 2019, I conducted a little case study to see how prevalent the problems of signing would be, particularly the problems that we discussed earlier in this video, but also to see whether any new problems would emerge. I submitted the results to the American Academy at the end of 2019, and it was accepted for presentation at the 2020 annual conference, which was held in February of 2020 in Anaheim in California. The paper was presented in the questioned documents section and led to some quite interesting discussion afterwards. For this case study, I selected 65 emails that were available to me. So they were not randomly selected, they were selected on a convenience basis, so I cannot generalize the results to a bigger audience. The emails that I selected spanned a period of 21 years, from July 1998 to July 2019. And was fairly evenly spread over that period. The idea of using these older emails made sense because that represents the typical documents that a questioned documents examiner would be faced with. The first problem that was immediately obvious was the fact that the majority of email addresses that identified people were no longer in use. And that I guess was to be expected. Perhaps we can still work around that in the sense that the question whether an email once belonged to a specific individual is not a particularly hard question to answer. On the practical side, there may be issues, though. A person who abandons an email address may no longer maintain the key. So may, for example, discard the secret key associated with that email address, or even discard the public key, which isn't always available publicly. In fact, about 50% of the keys, of the public keys that I needed, were available on key servers. So the other 50% were not publicly available and arguably had to be obtained from the people who created them and who probably no longer had them, given that the email addresses they were associated with were no longer in use. Of the 50% of public keys that I could find, about 50%, so 25% of the original sample had expired. And this caused other interesting problems. The problem was firstly in the way in which the tools reported it. The primary tool that I used, GPG for Win, reported simply that the key was expired and hence discarded the signature. However, it is possible, even if you have an old key, to check whether it still matches with what is expected. And GPG on Linux did in fact tell me that the signature was good, but the key was expired. So the GPG for Win simply discarded the signature outright. Question is whether one could rely on expired keys, because there's a reason why those keys expired. Yes, they were set to expire, but after they expired, the assumption may be that they would no longer be good keys, that one couldn't rely on them for such a long period, or even that the cryptographic strength of the key would no longer be adequate, and that would be the reason, or could be the reason, why they were set to expire. Also, once a key expired, the owner may no longer have treated the secret key with the same care that would have been employed while the key was still active. So when the signature turns out to be good with an expired key, it raises quite a couple of issues, and I cannot simply assume that because the signature is good with an expired key, I can trust the message in the sense that it was definitely signed by the person who purportedly signed it, and that it was still a valid indication of that person's signature after all of these years have passed. Another problem that emerged was the fact that none of the keys that I found on the key servers, so I found 50% of the keys on key servers, but none of them was signed by a third party. So there was no web of trust involved. There was no way of tracing the key and saying, yes, I trust this key. Now, this is quite possibly due to the context in which the key was used. In most of the correspondence that I had access to, messages were exchanged between people who knew one another, and they could easily tell the other person what the fingerprint of their public key was. And then there were a couple of other reasons why we could also trust those keys in such a back and forth key exchange, and I will return to those reasons a little bit later. The fact is that this was not an organization that consisted of many people, many of whom have not met personally, and when you got a message from someone, you wanted some way to authenticate the key to know that the signature was valid, because this was more in the context of person-to-person communications. A different set of rules applied, and the web of trust was not really important. Certificate authorities was also not important if they were available, because, as I mentioned, this was communication amongst people who knew one another and had other grounds to believe that the keys that they were using were indeed valid. In the end, it meant that about 25% of signed messages could be authenticated if we could trust the public key, if we could assume that the public key did indeed belong to the purported signer and that the key had not been compromised in the meantime. What grounds could we use as a basis for a belief that the key did belong to the purported signer? And secondly, what grounds do we have that the key had not been compromised? First issue is possible to resolve because in many cases a signed message was part of an exchange of messages. It was part of a conversation between two parties. And the conversation often followed a certain pattern. Perhaps some of the earlier message was quoted at the bottom of an email, although 20 years ago we often deleted the original message and just responded. Bandwidth was scarce. Or, as another example, the conversation could have dealt with the same topic. They were talking about some event and details were exchanged about that event, so there was continuity in that conversation. And if that continuity gives us the grounds that this is one coherent conversation, then the fact that one of the messages in this coherent conversation is signed may be grounds to believe that the key is authentic and therefore that the message is properly signed. It does depend on the nature of the conversation and a rather thorough analysis of the exchange of emails, a topic that we will return to later in our discussion of questioned digital documents in a later video. As one interesting example, I also found public keys that were published on the web. In fact, in this entire experiment, I only found one such key that was published on the web, and it was signed by the owner's Pki key. So in this case, the Pki key identified the website as authentic, as something that is issued by the owner of that public key. And from that, I could deduce that the public key was authentic. So in a strange way, this web of trust and the Pki signatures seem to be able to work together to speak to the authenticity of the signature. However, the bottom line of all of this is that 75% of the signatures could not be verified during this case study. As I said, we cannot generalize this to a broader population. The 25% of signatures that could be deemed to be good used old certificates and hence presented their own challenges. And of those 25%, we also had the vast majority of email addresses that had expired before this particular case study was performed. So the bottom line is that even though it seems like an ideal way of authenticating documents, in the end it is far from ideal. It is useful for those few cases where we can use it, but in the end it probably presents more challenges than the number of problems that it solves. It is one of the tools in our toolkit, so whenever it is useful, we should go ahead and use it, but we cannot rely on signatures, particularly not to the same extent that we could rely on them in the case of physical questioned documents.